Good afternoon, and welcome to OVW's fiscal year 2022 Transitional Housing Assistance Grants for Victims of Sexual Assault, Domestic Violence, and Stalking Solicitation Pre-Application Information Session. Hi, I'm Sharon Elliott, a program specialist on the Transitional Housing Unit, and on behalf of our Associate Director, Michelle Brickley, my teammates, Mirta Charles, Charlena Brady, Dana Marshall, who is currently deployed, and Zelda Tacky. I welcome you all to today's call. Mirta, I will hand this over to you to speak to our grantees about the Transitional Housing Program, so you can kick off this discussion.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate that so much. Good morning, all. Let's start off with our Transitional Housing Program description. I'll reference also our purpose area, our priority areas, our Transitional Housing Support Services, and then detailed about our priority areas. Let's get started. The Transitional Housing Program funds organizations to assist victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. We refer to these as the VAWA crimes. These are those who are homeless or in need of transitional housing as a result of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Again, the VAWA crimes. The Transitional Housing Program provides funding for survivors in need of transitional housing, short-term housing assistance, and related support services for 6 to 24 months. Eligible applicants are those that are states, units of local government, Indian tribes, and other organizations with a documented history of effective work concerning sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. We're going to go through what the purpose areas are versus the priority areas. It's important to understand the difference. The purpose areas are those indicated as part of the OVW Transitional Housing Program and must be adhered to. Those are what makes up the Transitional Housing Program that will be implemented. The OVW priority areas are optional. Those are the priorities that they're office-wide for FY22 solicitation. Let's go over the purpose areas. Funds under this program must be used for one or more of the following purposes. First, transitional housing. That's including funding for operating expenses of newly developed or existing transitional housing. That's purpose area 1. Or a second purpose area, it can be used for short-term housing assistance, including rental or utility payments, assistance with related expenses such as payment of security deposits, and other costs incidental to relocation to transitional housing. Purpose area 2. And purpose area 3. Provide comprehensive, voluntary support services designed for survivors fleeing a situation of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and/or stalking that helps victims transition into permanent, affordable housing. Those are the purpose areas under the Transitional Housing Program. The Transitional Housing Program support services are work as one. Grant recipients must provide both transitional housing, as we discussed, purpose areas 1 or 2, and they must provide support services, purpose area 3. So every project will have a purpose area 1 or 2. It could be purpose areas 1 and 2, and they must provide purpose area 3. OVW funds can provide transitional housing support services or both. If OVW funds are only used to provide either transitional housing or support services, then the other must be provided by a project partner and or another funding source. So to be clear, OVW funds may be used to provide either or, but both must be available to the client. The applicant must include this information on the data requested with the application, making clear what funding source is supporting the housing and the support services. Let's talk a little bit about the OVW priority areas. This year, OVW in FY 2022 has 4 priority areas. Those 4 priority areas are: 1, to advance racial equity as an essential component of ending sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Our second priority area is to expand economic justice and financial advocacy for survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, including as a tool for violence prevention. Our third priority is to increase the response to sex trafficking. And fourth, projects that primarily serve underserved populations. Those are the 4 priorities found for FY 2022 Transitional Housing Program. Let's go into a little bit more detail about each of these and how you determine which one will work with your project. Applicants may choose to apply for 1 priority area, 2, or 3. If not, they can choose all 4 or none at all. This is an option for the Transitional Housing Program. To qualify for priority area 1, advance racial equity as an essential component of ending the violent crimes, the applicant must be a culturally specific organization. They must demonstrate a documented history of effective work concerning the violent crimes. They must provide a detailed plan for assisting survivors from culturally specific communities in need of transitional housing services. And they may submit budgets for up to $550,000 for a 36-month period. Now, let me emphasize culturally specific means primarily programs directed toward racial and ethnic minority groups. Those include as American Indian, including Alaska Natives, Eskimos, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders, Blacks, and Hispanics. To review this priority area, please see page 9 of FY 22 solicitation. Let's go to area number 2. Priority area number 2, expand economic justice and financial advocacy for survivors of violent crimes as a tool for violence prevention. To qualify for this priority, an applicant must propose a project that demonstrates strong partnerships with workforce development or job training programs. They must provide a detailed plan for assisting survivors toward graduated economic empowerment and survivor autonomy while using a voluntary service model. If an applicant chooses this priority, they can submit budgets for up to $550,000 for a 36-month period. Priority number 3. This is to increase the response to sex trafficking. Applicants who choose to opt for this priority will look to propose projects that focus on direct intervention and advocacy services for victims of sex trafficking. Applicants here should demonstrate a substantive knowledge of how to meet sex trafficking victims' unique needs, including the provisions of transitional housing and support services to victims of sex trafficking. To propose in community-based partnerships to ensure appropriate referrals for substance abuse, mental health, and legal services. Applicants here should identify how they and their partners will engage in outreach to victims of sex trafficking. In order to meet this criteria, they submit budgets for up to $550,000, again, for a 3-year period. Priority number 4, projects primarily serving underserved populations. To qualify for this statutory priority area, The applicant must propose projects that primarily serve individuals from underserved populations who are victims of the VAWA crimes. The term underserved population means populations who face barriers in accessing and using victim services, and includes populations underserved because of geographic location, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, underserved racial and ethnic populations, and populations underserved because of a special need, such as a language barrier, disabilities, age. Applicants should provide a detailed plan identifying the underserved population that is going to be addressed. They should describe how the project will provide specific services to victims from identified underserved populations within the proposed project service area. They should describe gaps in the current services and barriers for victims seeking those services. And they should demonstrate a strong partnership with organizations with experience and history of services to each of these underserved communities. In doing so, they can submit budgets for up to $550,000 for a 3-year period. Applicants should look at the award and period amounts on page 9 of the FY22 solicitation for any additional details or information. With that, I'd like to hand this off to my colleague, Charlena Brady. Charlena, can you take us off to the next part of this solicitation, please?
Hello. I will discuss with you the prohibited activities and limits to funding, which include the activities that compromise victim safety, the out-of-scope activities, and the limited use of funds. Activities that compromise victim safety. OVW does not fund activities that jeopardize victim safety, deter or prevent physical or emotional healing for victims, or allow offenders to escape responsibility for their actions. Applications that propose any such activities may receive a deduction in points during the review process or may be eliminated from consideration. Information on activities that compromise victim safety and recovery or undermine offender accountability may be found in the solicitation companion guide. The following activities are out of scope: research projects, prevention activities, housing retention. This means that grant funds cannot be used to keep victims in their home or to prevent them from losing their current housing. With respects to family violence, grant funds may not be used to directly address child abuse or family violence issues, such as violence perpetrated by a child against a parent, or violence perpetrated by a sibling against another sibling, or neglect or exploitation. Grant funds may not be used for caregiver abuse of elders and other vulnerable adults. The activities listed here are out of scope and will not be supported by this program's funding. This language is found on page 7 of the FY22 solicitation. The following activities can be supported only in limited circumstances: legal services, the purchase and/or lease of vehicles, and services for children. Please see the solicitation and/or the solicitation companion guide for more detail on the limited use of funds. I will now pass it over to Sharon to discuss with you the federal award information.
Hi, everyone. So our federal award information consists of the following. The grant award period is for 36 months, and that begins on October 1 of 2022. Awards will be made for up to $550,000. New and continuation grantees are eligible to apply with the following exceptions. Recipients of FY 2020 or FY 2021 awards are not eligible to apply as the lead applicant or as an MOU partner on a FY 2022 proposal. Likewise, an organization that is an MOU partner on an FY 2020 or FY 2021 award is not eligible to apply as the lead applicant or as an MOU partner on an FY 2022 proposal. Current grantees with a substantial amount of unobligated funds remaining, meaning 50% or more of the previous award as of March 31st of 2022, without adequate justification as to why that amount is remaining, may not be considered for funding or may receive a reduced award amount if selected for funding in FY 2022. The award period and amounts. Please keep in mind that all awards are subject to the availability of appropriated funds, and there is no guarantee that funds will be available in the future. Funding levels for FY 2022 are listed here. Proposed budgets are for the entire 36-month project period. So, proposals to use grant funds for housing alone or for both housing and support services may submit budgets for up to $500,000. Proposals to use grant funds for support services only may submit budgets for up to $300,000. Proposals addressing the priority area advance racial equity as an essential component of ending VAWA crimes may submit budgets for up to $550,000. Proposals addressing the priority area expand economic justice and financial advocacy for survivors of VAWA crimes, including as a tool for violence prevention, may submit budgets for up to $550,000. Also keep in mind here, or make note, that OVW expects to prioritize up to 4 projects under this priority area. Proposals addressing the priority area increase the response to victims of human trafficking may submit budgets for up to $550,000. OVW expects to prioritize up to 4 projects under this priority. Proposals addressing the priority area primarily serve underserved populations may submit budgets for up to $550,000. And here again, OVW expects to prioritize up to 4 projects under this priority. Please see page 9 of the FY 2022 solicitation for additional information on the award period and amounts. Now we'll move to discuss the mandatory program requirements. So as an applicant and or a successful grant, an applicant to grantee, excuse me, here are some of the mandatory program requirements that you must adhere to. And in this case, as an applicant, participate in OVW-sponsored training and technical assistance. You would agree to do that. Recipients may be expected to dedicate some OVW-funded time and resources to participating in an assessment or evaluation. You would agree to submit your policies and procedures post-award and after attending new grantee orientation. And that's something you'll find out more about should you become a successful applicant. You would also adhere to rules governing the organization's transitional housing program and related support services. You would offer transitional housing and support services for at least 6 months and no more than 24 months with OVW grant funds. You would offer support services only to individuals receiving transitional housing, other than follow-up services that are described in our next bullet point. You would offer follow-up services for transitional housing clients who secure permanent housing. Follow-up services are limited to advocacy, support groups, case management, and minimal financial assistance. And that minimal financial assistance often looks like security deposits or first month's rent for permanent housing, provided for at least 3 months, but not more than a year. So follow-up services are limited and they are provided for a limited period of time of 3 months, but not more than a year. And here's our continued discussion on mandatory program requirements. You, as an applicant, would significantly involve a victim service provider in the implementation of the project, including the development and review of all policies and procedures and the provision of support services. You would ensure that any staff, partner staff, or service providers working with transitional housing clients are trained to work with victims of the violent crimes, meaning that they would be trained to work with victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking. You would send the project coordinator and one other key staff member to an in-person OVW new grantee orientation. You'd send key staff to an in-person OVW-sponsored training on voluntary services. You would agree to provide transitional housing to clients without requiring participation in support services. You'd notify OVW of any changes to the source of funding used to provide OVW grant-funded transitional housing and/or support services. You would compensate at least one, if not all, of your project partners for time and travel to participate in project development, training, and implementation. If a partner is a state or unit of local government and the partnership duties are conducted within the course of the agency's regular scope of work, the applicant does not need to compensate the partner if the partner offers this arrangement and an explanation of this arrangement is included in the application. Applicants that receive funding under this program will be required to engage in these activities, and the language for the mandatory program requirements can be found on page 10 of the FY22 solicitation. Okay, so for the next couple of slides, we'll focus on aspects of your application that relate to documents that our financial team, the Grants Financial Management Division, reviews. More specifically, we'll discuss some items that GFMD has identified from prior year applications that could help with expediting our process, our review process. So for today, we're going to highlight certain aspects of the data requested with application and the pre-award risk assessment and provide you a link to a detailed webinar on how to develop the budget that will be included in your application. The first things we'll highlight are the items identified in the data requested with application, which is required to be completed by all applicants. Specifically, 2 items we would like to discuss are the single audit response and the IRS 3-step safe harbor procedure. OVW requests that all applicants provide a statement as to whether they have expended $750,000 or more in federal funds during their last fiscal year, excuse me. If they have, then they indicate that and also specify the end date of their last fiscal year. However, GFMD is finding that applicants do not always include this information and leave out whether or not they have met the threshold, or the end date of their last fiscal year is not included. Please ensure this question is answered in its entirety on the data requested with application. So another item we'd like to highlight from the solicitation is specifically for nonprofit organizations. If you use the IRS 3-step harbor procedure to determine your executive's compensation, You must reference the additional information section that provides the required disclosure letter. We'd like to highlight that there are 4 parts of this disclosure letter that must be provided to OVW in order to comply with this requirement. The sample letter outlines all 4 parts of the disclosure, so please be sure to follow the sample and provide a response to each of the 4 pieces. The next item we'd like to discuss is the pre-award risk assessment, which assists GFMD during their pre-award risk assessment review of all applications. Each applicant must prepare a response to all questions. We've noticed from prior years that applicants do not always fully answer all parts of the questions, which in turn requires GFMD to reach out to the applicant, which may delay recommendations. Some of the most common issues that we've encountered have been, for example, where the applicant indicates that they do indeed have internal policies, but they don't provide a brief list of topics covered in the policies and procedures. Another example of incomplete responses is where the applicant does not provide a brief summary of the organization's process for tracking expenditures, and more specifically, whether or not it tracks budgeted versus actual expenses. These are just a few examples. Please make sure you read each piece of each question and provide a full, comprehensive response. Here we will highlight available resources that should be used as you're creating the budget to be submitted with the application. Over the last year, GFMD has worked to develop a detailed webinar presentation on how to assist applicants in developing a budget to be submitted with their OVW applications. They want to help reduce any challenges you may face with the budget and make clear what they look for when reviewing your budget. This webinar provides insight as to what OVW financial staff considers during their review. Use the budget webinar link that's found on page 16 of the FY 2022 Transitional Housing Solicitation. The webinar can be found under the budget information section on that page. Next up is the uniform guidance, which can be found at 2 CFR 200. Then another source is the DOJ Financial Guide, as well as the program-specific solicitation. If you need assistance finding any of these resources, please contact the GFMD Help Desk. We know that this can be a lot of information to process. So if you have any questions about the GFMD information discussed here, please feel free to contact the GFMD Help Desk at 888-514-8556 or via email at ovw.gfmd@usdoj.gov. And with that, I will pass the baton to my colleague, Mirta Charles. So we'll continue on with the discussion on other program eligibility requirements. That discussion includes qualified applications, required partnerships, the role of a victim services provider, voluntary services, and length of stay.
Thank you, Sharon.
You're welcome.
Let's talk about qualified applications. To be qualified for funding under this program, applications must meet the following statutory definition of qualified application. An application is deemed qualified if it has been submitted by an eligible applicant, which we discussed earlier. That page can be found on page 1 and 10 of the FY22 solicitation. A qualified application does not propose any of the activities that may compromise victim safety, including background checks of victims or clinical evaluations of victims to determine eligibility for services. That cannot happen to be a qualified application. We spoke about those activities that compromise victim safety earlier, and those you must adhere to. To be a qualified applicant, you have to reflect an understanding of the dynamics of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking within your proposal to meet this application qualification. And last, do not propose any prohibited activities, including mandatory services for victims. Again, that will speak to our knowledge of why we have voluntary services. Now, another program eligibility requirement is required partnerships. If an applicant is a victim service provider, they must include at least one other organization. For example, a housing provider, a local homelessness coalition, or other social service providers serving low-income households, including, let's say, community colleges, workforce centers, community action agencies, and/or public assistance departments as a required partner identified in the Memorandum of Understanding, known as the MOU. If an applicant is a tribe, if an applicant is a state or a unit of local government, the application must include both a victim service provider and a housing provider as required partners. They may include other types of partners as well, which what we listed above, what we were talking about, these must be identified in the MOU. If an applicant is an organization, including a domestic violence or sexual assault coalition, other nonprofit, non-governmental organization, or community-based and culturally specific organization that has a documented history of effective work concerning the VAWA crimes, then the application must include at least one other organization, as we spoke of, a housing provider, a homeless coalition, or the social service provider, as a required partner identified in the MOU. These are required partnerships. They're described here, but also demonstrated in the applicant's Memorandum of Understanding. And again, we see their experience in partnership reflected in the letter of experience. Those all come together in the Transitional Housing Program solicitation. Let's discuss the victim service provider. The victim service provider is a nonprofit, non-governmental or tribal organization or rape crisis center, including a state or tribal domestic violence or sexual assault coalition that assists or advocates for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking victims, including a domestic violence shelter, a faith-based organization, or other organizations with a documented history of effective work concerning domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Victim service providers must provide direct services to victims of VAWA crimes as one of their primary purposes and have a demonstrated history of effective work in that field. The victim service provider partner must play an active role in development and implementation of the project. This speaks to tribal organizations, that speaks to states, units of local government who must have a required partner of a victim service provider. Applications from a state, tribe, or unit of local government must demonstrate that the victim service provider is significantly involved in the project design and development and reviews all the policies and procedures and describes how the applicant will ensure that anyone working with transitional housing survivors is trained in working with victims of the VAWA crimes. To see a full description of victim service provider, please go to your page 11 of the FY22 solicitation. All applicants must identify their respective partnerships throughout the application narrative, as well as clearly and formally evidenced through the memorandum of understanding. And to see the memorandum of understanding guidelines, you'll see that on page 18 of the FY22 solicitation. Let me talk to you about voluntary services. All services, support services, and follow-up services provided to recipients of the transitional housing, either while in transitioning housing or when establishing permanent housing, must be voluntary. All services must be voluntary. And I know we've repeated it several, again, it doesn't hurt to mention the length of stay. Transitional housing with voluntary support services must be offered for, at minimum, 6 months and no more than 24 months. This is the window in which your project will be developed and implemented. Victims may request a waiver for up to additional 6 months if the victim has made a good faith effort to acquire permanent housing, but has been unable to do so. Please note, this is not shelter. This is not extended shelter. This is not rapid rehousing. This is not a financial assistance for just a few months or permanent subsidized housing. This is transitional housing. It is defined by OVW as housing that is offered for at least 6 months and no more than 24 months to serve as a bridge between emergency phase and permanent housing to survivors. Please develop programs with this framework in mind. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Charlena, who's going to talk to you about the application content in whole. Charlena, you take it from here.
Thank you, Mirta. All righty, now I'm going to discuss with you the contents of your application. Your application must include the data requested with application, an abstract, a proposal narrative, a budget detail worksheet and narrative, a memorandum of understanding, commonly referred to as the MOU. Also, you need to submit the letter of experience, which is commonly referred to as the LOE. OVW will not contact any applicants for any missing contents of your application. Applications that do not include the aforementioned items will be considered substantially incomplete and will not be considered for funding. I would also like to note that the proposal abstract is required, but failure to submit it will not result in removal from consideration. It is worth about 5 points, and more information about this is found on page 13 of the FY22 solicitation. All right, the data requested with application questionnaire is a required element and must be fully completed and submitted to successfully apply for this program. Applicants must respond to each question. More information about this can be found on pages 13 and 27 of the solicitation. The abstract is worth 5 points total, will be entered into just grants. It must provide a short summary, no more than 2 pages double-spaced, of the proposed project, including names of the applicant, its partners, the project title, the purpose of the project, primary activities for which funds are being requested, who will benefit, the products and deliverables, and how the applicant will measure progress in completing project goals and objectives. The project narrative includes the following sections and optional priority areas. The project narrative may not exceed 25 pages unless you are addressing one or more of the priority areas. In that case, you will have 1 page per priority area that you address. The project abstract and the data requested with application are not a part of the 25-page limit for the project narrative. Within the project narrative, you will address the purpose of the application, which includes the problem to be addressed and how funding would alleviate it, the target population, and how the target population would benefit. You will address what will be done, which includes the project goals and objectives and timeline, describing the specific tasks and activities necessary for accomplishing each. You will also address who will implement the project, organizations, and people responsible for implementing the project. The budget detail worksheet and narrative. All applications must include a detailed budget and narrative. Please see the sample budget detail worksheet and creating a budget webinar available on our website. Please keep in mind that budgetary requirements vary amongst programs. Applicants must submit reasonable budgets based on the resources needed to implement their projects in their specific geographic location. The budget and narrative will be reviewed separately from the proposed project narrative. The budget narrative must describe each line item requested in the budget and explain all costs included in the budget, including how the cost of goods and services are determined and how they will fulfill the objectives of the project. Your budget must display a clear link between the specific project activities and the proposed project items, budget items, and it must not contain items that are not supported by the project narrative. Your budget must include funds to attend OVW sponsored TA in the amount of $15,000 for applicants located within the 48 states and $20,000 for the applicants located within the territories. Your budget must include a statement describing whether the housing units are applicant owned or not. Your budget must include as program income any fees charged to transitional housing participants if the transitional housing is applicant owned. Your budget must include funds or describe other resources available to the applicant to support activities to ensure access for individuals with disabilities, deaf or hard of hearing individuals, and persons with LEP. Please see the accessibility under Federal Award Administration information for more detail. Your budget must compensate at least one, if not all of your project partners as reflected in the MOU. For more information on this, you can see the sample budget detail worksheet. And lastly, your budget must distinguish clearly between subawards and contracts in allocating any grant funds to other entities. All right, moving on to the MOU. All applicants must include a new MOU that is responsive to the FY22 solicitation. The purpose of the MOU is to allow applicants to demonstrate that their proposed projects will be developed by a team of collaborative partners. Remember, required partnership and role of victim service provider in the program eligibility requirements. The MOU should be very specific and mirror the project as described in the project narrative and budget. The MOU should also be a single document, signed and dated by the authorized representative of each partner agency and the applicant agency. Moving on to the LOE, the letter of experience. All applicants must submit a signed and currently dated LOE describing the applicant's organization's documented history of effective work concerning violent crimes or such experience and capacity of a partner if the applicant is a tribe, state, or unit of local government. Your LOE must address the following. Please describe the applicant organization's history of providing assistance to survivors of violent crimes. Please demonstrate a history of effective work serving victims of violent crimes by showing the number of years the agency has provided direct victim and/or housing services. Please describe the services provided to the victims and describe the qualifications or skills of the staff assigned to the grant and training that they have obtained, will obtain, and/or provided or will be provided. Applications from a tribe, state, or unit of local government must include a letter of experience from their victim service provider partner. In addition to the above information, the letter must make clear how the victim service provider will be involved in the implementation of the proposed project. I would also like to note that the LOE is limited to 2 pages. Any additional pages will not be reviewed. Applications will be removed from consideration if the LOE is missing, if it is not a single document, if it is not current, or if it is not signed or dated. A sample LOE is available at our OVW website. This language is also found on page 19 of the FY22 solicitation. I would like to pass it over to Sharon to discuss the application and submission information.
Thank you, Charlena. In this part of our discussion, we'll cover the limit on the number of applications that an organization can submit, formatting and technical requirements, submission and deadline information. It should be noted that applications for this program will be submitted through a 2-step process, which you'll find the 2-step process involves a submission to grants.gov as well as into the Justice Grants system, commonly known as Just Grants. And we will talk more about that as we get into the information around the application and submission requirements. But first, let's cover formatting and technical requirements. Applications must follow the formatting and technical requirements outlined on page 12 of the solicitation. Your narrative should be double-spaced on 8.5 by 11 inch paper with 1 inch margins, a font that's no smaller than 12 point, usually Times New Roman or Arial font is used and recommended except for footnotes, which may be in a 10-point font. Please include page numbers and headings and subheadings that correspond to the sections identified in the respective section of the solicitation. It's really important to follow these formatting guidelines as it relates to answering the specific sections in the solicitation. Word documents in the following formats. You should submit your documents in the format of Microsoft Word, a PDF file, or a text document. As mentioned earlier, your proposal should be no more than 25 pages. But if you are answering or addressing one of the priority areas, that page limit is expanded to up to 29 pages. The limit on number of applications. OVW will consider only 1 application per organization for the same service area. In addition, if an applicant submits multiple versions of the same application, OVW will review only the most recent system-validated version submitted before the deadline. I'll say that again. OVW will consider only 1 application per organization, and we will review only the most recent system-validated version submitted before the deadline. So keep that in mind as you prepare and submit your applications. Make sure your final submission is the one that you want us to review. Submission and deadline information. You can find all of this related information on page 21 of the FY22 solicitation, but I'll certainly cover some of those items here. After applicants register with the Systems for Award, commonly known as SAMs, they can begin the grants.gov registration process. The applying organization must complete the grants.gov registration process prior to beginning an application for a federal grant. The e-business point of contact, eBiz POC, must register the applicant organization with grants.gov. In Just Grants, each applying entity will have an assigned entity administrator who is responsible for managing entity level information and assigning roles in the system. The entity administrator is also the eBiz POC designated in sam.gov. So you see how all of those processes interface. You should see the Just Grants website for more information on registering with Just Grants. It is the applicant's responsibility to ensure that the application is complete and submitted by the deadline. Failure to meet the submission deadline will result in an application not being considered for funding. Applicants should refer to the list on page 21 of the solicitation to ensure that all required steps and deadlines are met. Failure to begin registration or application submission by the deadline it is not an acceptable reason for a late submission. I'll reiterate that. Failure to begin the registration process or failure to submit your application by the deadline is not an acceptable reason for a late submission. So there are some, here are 4 things that you must have done by March 24th. You must obtain your DUNS number. You must register with SAMS. You must register in grants.gov, and you must submit your letter of intent. All 4 of those actions must be completed by March 24th. If necessary, you can request a hard copy submission by April 9th. Applicants that cannot submit an application electronically due to lack of internet access must contact the program, and our phone number, our program's number is 202-307-6026, or you can reach us by email at ovw.transitionalhousing@usdoj.gov to request permission to submit a hard copy application. You should also download an updated version of Adobe Acrobat at least 48 hours before the grants.gov deadline. Applicants are responsible for ensuring that the most up-to-date version of Adobe Acrobat is installed on all computers that may be used to download the solicitation and to submit related forms on grants.gov. You should go to the Adobe software compatibility page to verify that the Adobe software version is compatible with grants.gov. Submit your SF424 and the SFLLL in grants.gov as early as possible, but no later than 24 to 48 hours prior to the grants.gov deadline. Register the entity administrator and the application submitter with grants.gov as early as possible, but no later than 48 to 72 hours before the grants.gov deadline. Submit the complete application package at least 24 to 48 hours prior to the Just Grants deadline, and confirm application receipt. Submitting the application components at least 48 hours before each deadline in grants.gov or Just Grants as applicable will enable the applicant to receive notice of a failed submission and provide an opportunity to correct the error before the applicable deadline. So it's really important that you meet these deadlines and that you submit your application well in advance of the deadline to avoid any glitches that you may encounter that would prohibit a timely submission of your application. So with that, I will pass the baton again to my colleague, Mirta Charles.
You, Sharon. Got the baton. Let's go. Let's talk about the basic minimum requirements. Once you've completed your application program project, and you're ready for submission. All your applications undergo a basic minimum requirement review once they're submitted. This review is to determine if the application will move forward to peer review. They will fall under consideration for funding. Applications missing any of the following elements will be removed from further consideration and will not be forwarded to peer review. So if your application is missing a project narrative, it will not be forwarded to peer review. If your budget narrative or your detailed worksheets are not included in your submission, your proposal will not be forwarded to peer review. If you have a MOU, it must be complete. It must be a single document. It can include multiple signature pages as long as each page includes the name and title of all the signatories. If you have 5 partners, you cannot have 5 separate MOUs. It must be just one. If it is not just one single document, it will not be forwarded to peer review. If you don't have a required partner, it will not be forwarded to peer review. And if you do not include a letter of experience, that is a single document that is signed and currently dated, again, your proposal will not be forwarded to peer review for further consideration for funding. Okay, these are the applications that are kicked out under review at the basic minimum requirement level. Please be clear and review this slide carefully to note these issues. You can look at your application and go to our application checklist at the end of the application. This is found on page 26 of the solicitation that emphasizes what the application must have. So this is how you get your application to peer review. Again, these are the positive ways that you can by submitting a project narrative, submitting a full budget narrative and detailed worksheet, submit your memorandum of understanding, one memorandum of understanding as a single document that is signed by all the project partners and the applicant agency, that the MOU is currently dated. It is made in conjunction with the current proposal, that your MOU has the required partners. You will need to submit your letter of experience, a letter of experience. The letter has to be signed. The LOE has current dates, and the LOE is current to the proposal. All those will get your application to peer review. Look at that closely. Look at the checklist. Make sure you know how your application is submitted so it has all those information that you need. Again, please go to your application checklist found on page 26 and go there and make sure that all the components of your application are in there. The ones that we emphasize are the ones that will make sure that you go past BMR into a peer review opportunity. Some other information I can provide for you that is found in our solicitation, but I can highlight will be, read the solicitation in its entirety before applying. Follow the solicitation. The information in the application should be detailed as possible. Continuation applicants should write the application as if this is the first time that OVW has ever heard of their project. To ensure that each section is completely addressed, even if it feels redundant. Number all the pages. Fully name and limit the use of acronyms included in the application. Information submitted beyond what is required in solicitation is not likely to be read by OVW staff or peer reviewers. Again, the page limits are added to each section. As you noted before in application content, please follow those guidelines. The OVW website contains information on transitional housing models and run structures. That's to help you in preparing your proposal. Please go to the OVW website to access that information. Also utilize the FY22 solicitation companion guide. This is additional information that helps you prepare your application fully and considers all the necessary pieces of your application to be strong. And again, visit the justicegrants.usdoj.gov for helpful guidance on the application submission process. Take the time to do that. And as Sharon had reiterated earlier, look at it 48 to 72 hours before the proposed deadlines to make sure that if there's any errors that you occur, that you have the opportunity to address them without missing the deadlines. Thank you. It has been a pleasure for us to be here with you today to go through the solicitation for transitional housing program for the FY22 competition. My colleagues and I are standby to answer your questions. Should you have them, you must email us at ovw.transitionalhousing, one word, @usdoj.gov, and we will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much from Sharon, Charlena, Mirta, and Michelle. We look forward to hearing from you, and more importantly, we look forward to your excellent proposals. Good day.